Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Welcome to our webcast of our Saturday morning class on Śaṅkarācāryaḥ's Ātma-bodha. We will continue with verse 14 in just a moment. We left off on verse 14. But first of all, just to introduce the next subject, and also there are two questions I'll answer very briefly here. In spite of the fact that the text is called Ātma-bodha, knowledge of Atma, our discussion has been on anatma, that which is not Atma, and we said that anatma, the body, mind, etc., is the locus of the problem. So just like a medical doctor must study anatomy to understand the locus of disease, we have to study the body, mind, etc. to understand the locus of the disease of samsara, as they say, samsara roga. In that context, we have already completed our study of the sharira traya, the three shariras, the three bodies, the sthula sharira, physical body, the sukshma sharira, the subtle body, non-physical body, within the physical body that enlivens the physical body, and the karana sharira, the causal body. And remember, it's very important to remember our definition of the causal body. The causal body is ignorance, avidya, because it's ignorance that is the root cause for the cycle of birth and rebirth. One of the questions was, is it the sukshma sharira that travels at the end of one life to the next, or is it the karana sharira that travels? Well, remember, karana sharira means ignorance. Doesn't really make sense to speak of ignorance traveling. The locus of ignorance is your buddhi, your mind, which is part of the sukshma sharira. So more accurate to say that the sukshma sharira travels, and the karana sharira, which is ignorance, has its locus in that sukshma sharira, abides in that sukshma sharira. The second question was how this cycle of birth and rebirth comes to an end, and the answer is pretty obvious. The karana sharira is the cause for the cycle. So to break that cycle of birth and rebirth, you need to destroy the cause for the cycle. The cause for the cycle is ignorance, avidya, which is at karana sharira. How to destroy the karana sharira sounds very esoteric, but how to destroy ignorance is the question. And of course, you destroy ignorance with knowledge, which is Ātma-bodha. Okay, those two questions are done. Our study of the three shariras is over. And then in the prior class, we began a very important discussion of the five koshas, the pancha koshas. Kosha meaning a covering or sheath. And we went through in some detail how the five koshas are equivalent in many ways to the three shariras. But the purpose of the topic, Panchakosha, is more to show the problem of identification. If you remember from the last class, I defined kosha as a locus of identification. That's not a very common translation, but it's a very accurate one. Each of the five koshas is a locus for identification. The physical body is a locus for identification. If I identify myself with this big lump of flesh, I then call myself Swami Tadatmananda, I call myself a teacher of Vedanta and Sanskrit. I call myself a male. I call myself someone who's aging rapidly. All of these attributes I've just mentioned are associated with this lump of flesh, not with my true nature, which is pure consciousness. Pure consciousness is not named Swami Tadatmananda. We call it Atma. Pure consciousness is neither male nor female. Pure consciousness is not a teacher. You get the point. Pure consciousness doesn't age. So these are attributes of the physical body, but these attributes get superimposed on my true self, consciousness. And that's why this Annamaya kosha, this kosha made of anna, food, is a locus for identification. Next is the pranamaya kosha, the kosha made of prana, life energy, life force. So if I say I am tired, or if I say I am sick, I'm ill, the illness and tiredness are attributes that properly belong to the pranamaya kosha and not to consciousness. Consciousness doesn't get ill. Consciousness doesn't get tired. This is the problem of superimposition. This is the problem that makes us suffer so much. And so we see then that the pranamaya kosha is the second locus of identification. Next, the manomaya kosha, the kosha made of manas, mind. If I say I am happy or sad, if I say I am agitated or calm, these are attributes of the manas, mind. But I superimpose these, if I superimpose these attributes on Atma, I create problems. I create suffering. These attributes, like agitation and sadness, belong to the mind. They don't belong to consciousness. We'll understand this more clearly in the second half of this 14th verse. So the manomaya kosha is another third locus of identification. Then vijnanamaya kosha. Vijnana is a fancy word for buddhi, intellect. So the vijnanamaya kosha is yet another locus for confusion, for superimposition, for identification. If I say I am intelligent, or if I say I am confused, intelligence and confusion belong to the intellect, not to my true nature as consciousness. So these attributes of the buddhi, intellect, get superimposed on consciousness. In this way, the vijnanamaya kosha is the fourth locus of identification. And the fifth is the anandamaya kosha. Ananda, loosely, bliss. And it's what remains in deep sleep, in dreamless sleep. In dreamless sleep, you have no experience of your physical body. You have no experience of the pranamaya kosha, manomaya kosha, and vijnanamaya kosha. The only kosha that is present in your experience is anandamaya kosha. That's the experience of dreamless sleep. So if you say, waking up, if you say, I was blissful in sleep, or if you say, I was in a state of deep ignorance in sleep, I was ignorant in sleep, I didn't know anything. These are expressions of identification with the anandamaya kosha. So in this way, the anandamaya kosha is the fifth locus of identification. Okay, we can now continue. We saw the first half of the 14th verse in our prior class. We'll continue with the second half today. Let's recite it. Recite after me, please. Panchakoshadi yogena, Panchakoshadi yogena, Tattanmaya hivastitaha, Tattanmaya hivastitaha, Shuddhatma nilavastradi, Shuddhatma nilavastradi, Yogena spatiko yatha, yogena spatiko yata. First half we already saw. The subject of the whole sentence is actually the beginning of the third line. Shuddhatma. Shuddha Atma, the pure self, pure consciousness, it is panchakoshadi yogena. Yogena, due to association. My translation here, in the presence of, is not as accurate as what I just said. Due to the association with the panchakoshas, with the 5 koshas, that Shuddhatma, that pure self, which is stitaha, which abides along with the 5 koshas, what happens? Tat tanmayaha iva. It Eva becomes as though tat mayaha, the same as each one, or better, identified with each one. We saw this in the last class. The pure conscious self, Shuddhatma, becomes identified with each of the 5 koshas in the presence of the 5 koshas. Then, second half. Nila vastradi yogena spatikaha yatha. Another drishtanta, another metaphor. Almost every verse we see a new metaphor, drishtanta. Here the drishtanta in the last line, yatha, just like spatika. Spatika is a crystal. A crystal, yogena, in association with Nila vastradi. Vastra means cloth. Nila vastra is a blue cloth. In this case, we have an orange cloth. So yatha, just as a crystal, spatika, in association with different colors of cloth, acquires the color of that cloth. And here we have the example. This clear crystal appears orange in the presence of the orange cloth. The orangeness that you see in the clear crystal, that orangeness doesn't belong to the crystal, it belongs to the cloth. If you mistakenly conclude it's an orange crystal, you have superimposed an attribute of the cloth on the crystal. Notice the metaphor. Due to the presence of the cloth, a clear crystal appears orange, appears to take on the attribute of the cloth. The cloth represents each of the 5 koshas. And just as the orangeness of the cloth gets superimposed on the clear crystal, in the same way the attributes of each of the 5 koshas get superimposed on the Shuddhatma, on the pure self. This is a brilliant metaphor. It's been used for centuries, and it is so clear. It's another favorite example of how experience fools us. I've spoken about this several times before. We, in modern times, have become overly reliant on experience to tell us what's real. Examples we've given before. The sun doesn't really go down. The earth is turning. This chair really isn't solid. It's made of atoms that are almost all empty space. I've given these examples before. Examples that shows how experience fools us, so we have to be very careful about experience. Here we have the experience of orangeness in the crystal. Another experience that fools us. In the same way, we have experiences associated with each of the 5 koshas, and each of those experiences fool us. So the experience of having this physical body is an experience that can fool you into thinking that you are this body. The experience of tiredness or illness that belongs to your pranamaya kosha fools you into thinking that you, consciousness, are tired or ill. In the same way, happiness and sadness are experienced. But the happiness and sadness belongs to your mind, just like the orangeness belongs to the crystal. Happiness and sadness belongs to your mind, not to you. But the experience of happiness and sadness can confuse us. This is the issue. And it's a central issue. Let's examine this a little bit. Look at this. Does the orangeness really affect this crystal? Even a little bit. The fact is, not a bit of orangeness rubs off on the crystal. The crystal remains utterly pure, clear, in spite of the appearance of orangeness. In the same way, happiness and sadness in your mind don't affect consciousness, the consciousness which reveals happiness and sadness in your mind. We've spoken of this several classes ago. Happiness and sadness are mental events present in your mind, illumined by the consciousness which is your essential nature. When you're happy or sad, it feels like that happiness and sadness rubs off on consciousness. Feels that way. But does it really rub off? Does the happiness and sadness of your mind truly rub off on consciousness? Well, does this orangeness truly affect the crystal? Not at all. We need to be very clear in our understanding that the experience of orangeness is a misleading experience. It can't be trusted. In the same way, the experience that your consciousness is affected by happiness or sadness in your mind, that experience cannot be trusted. The truth is, just as this crystal is utterly unaffected by the orangeness that belongs to the cloth, in the same way, your consciousness, the consciousness that's your essential nature, is utterly unaffected by happiness and sadness which belong to your mind. Like orangeness belongs to the cloth and doesn't affect the crystal, happiness and sadness belongs to your mind and doesn't affect consciousness at all. So, good. Yatha, just as spatikaha, just as the crystal, nilavastradi yogena, due to its association with different colored cloths, it takes on the color of the cloth. This is the metaphor that represents how Atma, due to the presence of the five koshas, the attributes that belong to the five koshas are wrongly superimposed on Atma. Good. Then we'll continue verse 15. This verse concludes our topic of the five koshas. Repeat after me, please. Vapustu shadibih koshair, vapustu shadibih koshair, yuktam yuktiyavaghatataha, yuktam yuktavaghatataha, atmanamantaram shuddham, atmanamantaram shuddham, vivincyatandulam yatha, vivincyatandulam yatha. Another metaphor, another drishtanta. Notice how the prior verse and this verse both end in yatha. Yatha means just as. And here, yatha in the last line, just as tandulam, the prior word. Tandula is grain, like rice or wheat. Yatha, just like tandulam, grain, is, go up now to the, by the way, in this verse, the words are scattered all over the place. I mentioned before that when verses are composed in meter, these verses are composed in a meter that has 8 syllables and a quarter, and there are a lot of rules about short and long syllables, which causes word order to be jumbled. So we have to unjumble the words of this verse. Yatha, just as, tandulam, grain, which is in the second line, yuktam, associated with. Grain which is associated with what? Top line, koshaihi, with koshas, plural. Koshas covering in the most broad sense. In this case, the grain is covered by what kind of kosha? Tushadibihi. Tusha is the chaff, is the English word. Chaff is the husk. You can imagine a little grain of rice with the husk covering that grain. The grain is tandulam, and the husk is tusha. So, just as that grain is yuktam, it is covered by tushadibihi koshaihi, coverings of husk. To make our metaphor work, imagine that there are 5 layers of husk. I don't know if there are 5 or not, I don't know. But imagine that the kernel of grain is covered by 5 layers of husk. Those 5 layers obviously representing the pancha kosha, 5 koshas. So before you can eat that grain, you have to remove the husk. How do you remove husk from grain? Well, by, in the second line, avaghatataha. Avaghata is striking, by beating, or you translate it by threshing. By threshing the rice, you remove the husk from the grain. This is a metaphor, the drishtanta. So just as by threshing the rice, you remove the husk from the grain, in the same way, here in the metaphor represents Atma. And here Atma is referred to by the first word, a little unusually, vapus. Vapus often means body, but it has some other meanings as well. One meaning is the essence of something is vapus. Another meaning is embodied. So here vapus really means that which is embodied, that which is within the physical body. Vapus here means Atma, the true self. So the metaphor is telling us that vapus, Atma, the true self, is yuktam, dropping down a line, it is associated with koshaihi, with koshas, not with husk. It's associated with the 5 koshas, pancha koshas that we've just seen. And those koshas have to be removed. How to remove the koshas? You remove the husk from rice by threshing. And here it's a little bit like a pun. It says, you remove the 5 koshas covering Atma, not by threshing, but yukti avaghatataha, by threshing with logic, by the threshing of reasoning. My translation here is good. By threshing it with reason, by threshing the true self by threshing it with reason, not by grinding it with a mortar and pestle or running it through a machine, but by threshing the true self with reason. You can separate out the true self from the 5 koshas, and that's what the second half says. By threshing yukti avaghatataha, by threshing the true self with reason. It's kind of a play on words. by threshing the true self with reason. In the last line, vivinciat. You should separate out what? In the third line, atmanam, the true self, which is antaram, inside. Just like the grain, the kernel, is inside the husk. In the same way, atmanam, the true self, is antaram. It is inside the 5 koshas. And the true self is shuddham, pure. We use that word pure too casually. Here, let's be very clear what that word shuddham means. It means that the true self, even though it's covered by the 5 koshas, is utterly unaffected by the 5 koshas. That's what shuddha, pure, means. Just as this crystal is utterly unaffected by the orangeness of the cloth, in the same way, Atma, the true self, remains shuddham, pure, utterly unaffected by the attributes that belong to the 5 koshas, which as though cover the true self. Very important point made here by Śaṅkara, and that is the solution. He uses the word yukti, which means reasoning in the second line, but yukti implies knowledge. It's a separation between Atma and Anatma, a separation between your true self and the 5 koshas which seem to cover it. How to separate it? Please don't make the mistake. Separating a rice, the kernel from the husk, those are physical entities. Here we're not talking about a physical separation. We're talking about a separation that takes place in terms of understanding, in terms of knowledge. The term we use here is viveka. Viveka means discernment, being able to separate one thing from another. So we require these teachings of Vedanta to help us properly discern that our true self, Satchidananda Atma, pure consciousness, is within the 5 koshas and separate from the 5 koshas and utterly unaffected by the 5 koshas. The problem of, this ends our subject matter, so let's just summarize it here. When you identify with your physical body, Annamaya kosha, you suffer because the problems that belong to your body become your problems. Consciousness owns problems now. Consciousness is pure. But due to identification, you end up owning the problems of the Annamaya kosha, Pranamaya kosha, Manomaya kosha, etc. None of these problems truly belong to your true self, consciousness. Due to superimposition, you identify with the 5 koshas and suffer as a consequence. The solution to the problem of suffering, then, is discernment. Discernment means to understand that orangeness belongs to the cloth and doesn't affect the crystal at all. In the same way, discernment, viveka, means to understand the problems of your body belong to your body. The problems of prana belong to prana. Problems of your mind and intellect belong to your mind and intellect. And none of those problems can affect your true nature as consciousness at all. Your consciousness is shuddha. We use the term shuddha chaitanya, pure consciousness. Just as the crystal is pure in the sense that it's utterly unaffected by any color, in the same way, your consciousness is utterly unaffected. And this is a matter of discernment and not a matter of experience. In fact, it's experience that gets us in trouble. It's your experience of the orangeness in the crystal that leads you to confusion. It's your experience of having a body, having a mind, having an intellect. These experiences cause confusion. The solution is not more experience. The conclusion is to the solution is not more experience or a special experience. Some people think that enlightenment is a result of a special experience. Experiences come and go. Experiences are unreliable, and experiences cause confusion. What we're after is discernment, viveka, knowledge, vidya, to properly understand our experience and to discern the fact that your true conscious nature is utterly unaffected by any and all experiences. Okay, that concludes that subject matter.